Story 1. Kalen and the Whispering Stones. In the misty valleys, where ancient cedars touched the clouds, there lived a young potter named Kalen, whose hands could shape clay, but whose heart remained unformed. Each dawn found him at his wheel, creating vessels that held water, but never seemed to contain the peace he sought. His cottage sat beside a stream that carried the voices of stones, worn smooth by countless seasons of patient flowing. Kalen's creations were admired throughout the valley. Merchants traveled great distances to acquire his bowls and cups, each piece bearing the subtle imperfections that spoke of human touch. Yet despite his success, he felt hollow, like one of his own vessels waiting to be filled with something he could not name. One autumn evening, as crimson leaves danced on the wind, like prayers made visible, an elderly woman appeared at his door. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to walk softly upon the earth. Her name was Miraleth, and her eyes held the depth of still water, reflecting starlight. "Young potter," she said, her voice carrying the gentleness of rain on thirsty soil. "I have traveled far to commission a piece from your hands, but not for myself. The vessel I seek is for you." Kalen invited her inside, offering tea brewed from herbs that grew wild beside his stream. As steam rose from their cups, Miraleth spoke of a pottery wheel that stood in a hidden grove carved from a single ancient oak that had witnessed 1,000 seasons of growth and release. Then this wheel, she explained, shapes not only clay, but also the hearts of those who work at it. Many have sought it, but few have found what they truly needed there. Intrigued, yet uncertain, Kalen agreed to accompany her. They set out the following morning, walking paths that seemed to shift and change like water finding its course. The forest grew deeper around them, filled with the soft conversations of leaves and the distant songs of birds preparing for their southern journey. After hours of walking, they emerged into a circular clearing where golden light filtered through branches arranged like cathedral windows. At the center stood the wheel. Miraleth had described its surface, polished smooth by generations of seeking hands. Beside it sat mounds of clay that seemed to pulse with inner life. "Sit," Miraleth instructed gently. "Create as you always have, but listen as you work. The wheel will teach you what your hands already know, but your mind has forgotten." Kalen approached the ancient wheel and began to work. At first the clay felt familiar, beneath his fingers responding to techniques he had mastered through years of practice. But gradually, something shifted. The wheel seemed to turn of its own accord, guiding his hands, rather than being guided by them. As he worked, Kalen began to hear something he had never noticed before: the whispered wisdom of the stones in his stream, the patient teachings of earth and water, fire and air. The clay spoke of transformation, of accepting each moment, of shaping without resistance, of finding beauty in the very act of becoming. Hours passed unnoticed. The sun traced its arc overhead, while Kalen's hands moved in rhythm with something larger than himself. He created vessels unlike any he had made before, each one perfectly imperfect, bearing the marks of genuine surrender to the creative process. When twilight painted the grove in shades of purple and gold, Kalen finally lifted his hands from the wheel. Before him sat a simple bowl, neither the largest nor most ornate he had ever created, yet somehow it contained everything he had been searching for. Miraleth approached and placed her weathered hand on his shoulder. "What have you learned, young potter?" Kalen lifted the bowl, feeling its weight and warmth. "I have learned that I was trying to fill myself from the outside, when what I needed was already within. Like clay, that must be hollow to be useful, I had to empty myself of striving to discover what was already there." The old woman smiled, her face creasing like well-loved leather. "The greatest vessels are not those that hold the most, but those that give most freely. Your stream has been teaching you this all along. If you had only listened to the wisdom of stones, shaped by patient water." As they prepared to leave the grove, Kalen realized that Miraleth had given him more than a lesson in pottery. She had shown him that mastery comes not from controlling the clay, but from becoming one with it, allowing the creative force to flow through him, like water through a riverbed. The walk home passed in comfortable silence, each step returning him to his familiar world, yet seeing it with new eyes. His cottage, his wheel, even the whispering stones in his stream, all remained the same, yet everything had changed, for he himself had been reshaped by the gentle pressure of understanding. From that day forward, Kalen's pottery carried a different quality. Those who purchased his vessels often spoke of feeling peaceful in their presence, as if the clay itself had learned the secret of contentment. And in the evenings, when his work was done, Kalen would sit beside his stream and listen to the ancient wisdom of stones, understanding finally that the greatest art lies not in creating something new, but in revealing what has always been, waiting patiently to be discovered. Story 2. The Sarian and the Garden of Forgotten Dreams. Beyond the village, where Kalen's pottery brought peace to many homes, in a valley where mist clung to hillsides, like memories refusing to fade, lived a dream keeper named Thessarian, whose gift had become his burden. Each night, he walked through the sleeping world, gathering the dreams that people had abandoned or forgotten, storing them in a garden that existed between waking and sleeping. Thessarian's garden sprawled across dimensions invisible to ordinary sight, filled with crystalline trees that bore fruit made of pure intention, and flowers that bloomed in colors that had no names in the waking world. Here grew the dreams of children who had stopped believing in magic, the aspirations of adults who had chosen safety over wonder, and the hopes of elders who had forgotten that time was not their enemy. For decades, Thessarian had tended this ethereal sanctuary alone, believing himself the guardian of humanity's lost potential. His tall, slender form moved through pathways lined with luminescent moss, his silver hair catching light that came from everywhere and nowhere. Yet despite being surrounded by countless dreams, he had begun to feel increasingly disconnected from the very essence he protected. The garden had grown heavy with accumulated visions, some so old their colors had begun to fade like autumn leaves. Thessarian noticed that new dreams arrived less frequently, and those that did seemed smaller, more cautious, as if the world was slowly forgetting how to dream boldly. One evening, as he pruned a vine that grew impossible geometric patterns, a soft voice called from the garden's entrance. A young girl named Lyrelay stood at the threshold, her presence unusual, because living beings rarely found their way to this place consciously. "Keeper of dreams," she said, her voice carrying the clear tones of mountain streams. "I have come seeking something I have lost." Thessarian approached her carefully, noting how her eyes held the peculiar brightness of someone who lived equally in both worlds of sleeping and waking. "Many seek what they have lost here, child. Tell me of your dream." Lyrelay's gaze swept across the garden's impossible beauty. "I once dreamed of painting pictures that could heal hearts, of creating colors that would mend what was broken in the world. But the dream grew too large for me to hold, and I let it slip away one night, when doubt crept into my sleep." The dreamkeeper nodded thoughtfully. He had seen her vision among his collection, a magnificent tree whose branches bore paintings instead of leaves, each canvas pulsing with the power to transform sorrow into understanding. It was one of the most beautiful dreams in his care, yet it had grown dim from separation from its dreamer. "Come," Thessarian said, leading her down a winding path, where dream butterflies danced between hanging gardens of crystallized wishes. I will show you what you seek, but first you must understand why dreams sometimes must be released to find their way back to us. They walked through groves where laughter grew like bamboo, reaching toward skies painted with the hopes of every soul who had ever wished upon a star. The Sarian shared stories of other dreamers who had come before, each seeking to reclaim something they believed they had lost forever. There was a musician who dreamed of composing symphonies that could stop wars, he told her, as they passed a section where musical notes grew like flowers, their melodies visible as streams of colored light. He spent years searching for his lost dream, only to discover that it had been transformed by his life experiences into something even more powerful, the ability to create simple songs that brought families together around dinner tables. Lyra Lay listened with growing understanding as they approached the heart of the garden, where the oldest and most magnificent dreams resided. Here stood her tree, its painted leaves shimmering with untapped potential, yet somehow incomplete without its dreamer's presence. Your dream has been waiting, the Sarian said softly, but it has also been learning. Dreams you see continue to grow, even when separated from their dreamers. They gather wisdom from the collective unconscious, evolving in ways their original visionaries could never imagine. As Lyra Lay approached her dream tree, its painted leaves began to brighten, responding to her proximity, like flowers turning towards sunlight. But something unexpected happened. Instead of simply reclaiming her vision, she began to see how it had transformed during their separation. The paintings on the leaves were no longer just her own artistic creations. They had become collaborative works, incorporating the healing energies of every soul who had ever sought comfort in art. Her dream had grown beyond personal expression into something that served the greater tapestry of human connection. I understand now, she whispered, reaching out to touch one of the luminous paintings. I thought I had lost my dream because I could not make it real in the way I first imagined. But dreams are not meant to be caged by our initial understanding of them. The Sarian smiled, feeling a warmth he had not experienced in years. And what will you do with this understanding young dreamer? Lyra Lay's eyes sparkled with renewed purpose. I will return to the waking world and begin painting again, but differently. Instead of trying to force my dream into existence, I will allow it to express itself through me, trusting that it knows its own path to manifestation. As she prepared to leave the garden, something remarkable occurred. The tree began to release some of its painted leaves, which transformed into butterflies of pure creative energy. These dream butterflies scattered throughout the garden, touching other dormant visions and awakening them to new possibilities. The Sarian watched in wonder as his garden began to transform. Dreams that had lain heavy with abandonment started to stir and reshape themselves, as if Lyra Lay's understanding had given them permission to evolve beyond their original forms. You have given me a great gift, the Dreamkeeper told her. I had forgotten that my role is not to preserve dreams unchanged, but to nurture their growth and help them find their way back to the world when they are ready. Lyra Lay smiled, her form beginning to fade as she returned to waking consciousness. And you have shown me that no dream is ever truly lost. It is only waiting for us to grow large enough to hold its transformed beauty. After her departure, the Sarian began his work anew, but with a different understanding. Instead of merely collecting abandoned dreams, he became a facilitator of their evolution, helping them grow and change until they were ready to return to the world in forms their dreamers could finally embrace. The garden bloomed with renewed vitality, no longer a repository of lost hopes, but a nursery where dreams matured into wisdom. And in the village below, people began to notice their dreams returning to them at night, not as they had originally imagined them, but transformed by time and understanding into visions they were finally ready to make real. Story 3. Zephyra and the Library of Unspoken Words. In the mountains, where clouds were born from the marriage of earth and sky, there stood a library unlike any other, tended by a keeper named Zephyra, whose responsibility was both sacred and sorrowful. This was the Library of Unspoken Words, where all the things that people meant to say but never did found their home among endless shelves that stretched beyond the horizon of ordinary sight. Zephyra moved through the vast halls with the quiet reverence of someone who understood the weight of silence. Her auburn hair was always adorned with a single white feather that had fallen from the wing of a crane who visited the library each season, and her eyes held the patient sadness of someone who had witnessed countless opportunities for connection pass by unspoken. The library housed every declaration of love that died on trembling lips, every apology that pride prevented from being voiced, every word of encouragement that fear kept locked in caring hearts. These unspoken words took physical form, here appearing as books, whose pages turned themselves scrolls that unfurled in the wind of what might have been, and sometimes as butterflies made of crystallized intention that fluttered through the aisles seeking their intended recipients. For centuries, Zephyra had cataloged and organized these silent communications, creating elaborate systems to preserve them against the erosion of time. She understood their importance, knowing that unspoken words often carried more power than those that found their voice precisely because they remained pure potential, untainted by the imperfections of delivery or the misunderstandings of reception. The library grew heavier each day. New additions arrived constantly. A father's unexpressed pride in his daughter's achievements, a student's unvoiced gratitude to a teacher who changed their life, a friend's unspoken forgiveness that could have healed a decades-old rift. Zephyra felt the accumulating weight of all this unuttered communication pressing down upon her shoulders like a mountain of missed connections. One morning, as dawn painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold, a visitor arrived whose presence immediately distinguished him from the occasional scholars and seekers who found their way to the library. Calum was a traveling messenger whose profession was to carry words across great distances, yet he moved with the weary gait of someone who had lost faith in the power of communication itself. Keeper of the unspoken, he said, his voice carrying the roughness of someone who had spoken too many words that brought pain rather than healing. I seek to understand why some words refuse to be born while others escape us and cause such damage. Zephyra studied this messenger, whose silver-streaked beard suggested years of traveling between distant places and distant hearts. You carry words for others, she observed, yet you seem burdened by your own unspoken truths. What brings you to seek understanding here? Calum's shoulders sagged, as if releasing a burden he had carried for countless miles. I have delivered messages of love that came too late, carried news of death to those who had not spoken their farewells, and witnessed the aftermath of words that should have remained unspoken. I no longer trust my judgment about what should be said and what should remain silent. The library keeper nodded with deep understanding. She had observed this phenomenon in many who worked with words professionally. They became so aware of language's power to heal or wound that they sometimes lost the natural instinct for appropriate expression. "Well, come," Zephyra said, leading him through corridors lined with shelves that hummed with potential energy. "Let me show you something that might restore your perspective." They walked past sections dedicated to different types of unspoken communication. The halls of unvoiced gratitude, where thank you letters wrote themselves in golden ink that never dried. The gardens of silent comfort, where words of solace grew like healing herbs, waiting to be harvested, and the archives of unexpressed dreams, where hopes and aspirations took the form of origami birds that never ceased their attempts to fly. In the heart of the library stood a peculiar installation, a circular room where hundreds of speaking tubes emerged from the walls, each one connected to a place in the world where someone was struggling with words they could not find the courage to express. The tubes carried not the words themselves, but the emotional resonance behind them, creating a symphony of human longing for connection. "Listen," Zephyr instructed softly, and Caleb approached one of the tubes. Through it, he heard the emotional echo of a mother who wanted to tell her grown son how proud she was of the man he had become, but feared her words might sound patronizing. Through another, he sensed an elderly man's desire to apologize to his brother for a quarrel that had lasted 40 years, held back only by uncertainty about whether forgiveness was possible. As Caleb moved from tube to tube, experiencing the raw emotional truth behind countless unspoken communications, something shifted in his understanding. These were not failures of communication, but moments of deep caring. People who hesitated because they understood the weight of words, who struggled with expression because they cared so deeply about the outcome. "I had forgotten," he said quietly, "that the desire to speak perfectly often comes from love, not fear. These people aren't afraid of words themselves. They're afraid of not loving well enough through their words." Zephyra smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in decades. "And now you understand why some words must remain unspoken until their time is right. Silence is not always the absence of communication. Sometimes it is communication preparing itself to be worthy of what it wishes to express." Together they spent the day moving through the library, but instead of simply cataloging and preserving the unspoken words, they began to nurture them. Zephyra showed Caleb how to tend the words, like a gardener tends seeds, providing them with the nutrients of understanding and patience, so they might eventually find their way into the world at precisely the right moment. As evening approached, Caleb realized that his own unspoken words, gratitude to teachers who had shaped his youth, love for a sister he had not seen in years, forgiveness for himself for the times his messages had brought pain, were beginning to ripen within him like fruit ready for harvest. "The library will always exist," Zephyra told him as he prepared to resume his travels. "But perhaps its purpose is not to hold these words forever, but to give them the time and space they need to transform from potential into purpose." Caleb nodded, understanding finally that his role as a messenger was not to judge which words deserved expression, but to create safe pathways for words to travel when they were ready to make the journey from heart to heart. After his departure, Zephyra noticed something remarkable happening in the library. The unspoken words seemed lighter somehow, as if understanding their purpose had freed them from the weight of incompletion. Some began to transform themselves, becoming not direct communications, but inspirations that would guide their intended speakers toward the right words at the right time. The library remained full, but it no longer felt heavy. Instead, it hummed with the energy of potential seeking its perfect moment of expression. And Zephyra understood that her role was not to preserve silence forever, but to midwife the birth of words when they were mature enough to heal rather than harm. In villages across the world, people began to notice subtle changes. Difficult conversations became slightly easier. Apologies found their way to waiting hearts, and love discovered new courage to speak its truth, all because unspoken words had been given the time and care they needed to ripen into wisdom. Story 4. Nythera and the Weaver of Time. High in the crystal caves, where echoes held memories longer than stone held water, lived a timekeeper named Nithara, whose gift was both blessing and burden. She possessed the ability to weave temporal threads, creating tapestries that could slow rushing moments or quicken the passage of painful periods, yet she herself remained trapped in the relentless forward march of linear time. Nithara's workshop existed in a cavern, lit by phosphorescent crystals that pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeat of the earth itself. Her loom was carved from meteoric stone, its frame stretching between stalactites that had grown for millennia. Upon it, she wove with threads spun from captured moments, the golden strand of a child's laughter, the silver fiber of a grandmother's wisdom, the deep purple cord of lovers' first embrace. Her reputation had spread throughout the realm, bringing visitors who sought to alter their relationship with time. Merchants wanted to extend profitable seasons, students wished to slow their learning periods, and the grieving hoped to speed past their darkest hours. Nithara accommodated them all, yet found herself increasingly isolated from the natural flow of existence. The paradox of her situation weighed heavily upon her. While she could manipulate time for others, creating temporal refuges where they could rest or accelerate through difficulty, she experienced every moment at its designated pace. She had become a conductor, orchestrating temporal symphonies. She could never fully experience watching others dance to rhythms she could create but not join. One winter morning, when frost painted the cave entrance in delicate fractals, an unexpected visitor arrived. Ethan was a wandering philosopher whose aged appearance belied eyes that sparkled with the curiosity of eternal youth. He moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had made peace with time's passage, and his presence immediately calmed the restless energy that usually surrounded Nithara's workshop. Master Weaver, he said, his voice carrying the patient cadence of someone who had learned to savor each word. I come not seeking to change time, but to understand it better. Your reputation speaks of one who controls temporal flow, yet I sense in you someone who has forgotten how to simply be present within time's natural rhythm. Nithara paused in her weaving, studying this unusual visitor who sought understanding rather than alteration. You speak truly, philosopher. I have spent so many years bending time to others' needs that I have lost touch with my own relationship to the present moment. Each second I experience feels like a missed opportunity to be elsewhere else when. Ethan approached her loom, observing the intricate patterns she had created. Some sections showed time compressed into dense knots of rapid experience, while others stretched moments into gossamer threads of extended awareness. The overall effect was beautiful, but somehow discordant, like a song played at the wrong tempo. Tell me, he said gently, when did you last create something not for another, but simply for the joy of creation itself? The question struck Nithara like a bell, its resonance revealing an emptiness she had not acknowledged. She could not remember the last time she had woven without purpose, without someone else's temporal needs driving her craft. Her art had become entirely service-oriented, disconnected from her own creative spirit. Ethan settled himself on a crystal formation, his movements deliberate and mindful. May I share with you a story that was once shared with me when I too struggled with the nature of time. As Nithara continued her work, listening with the part of her attention that could multitask across temporal dimensions, Ethan spoke of a river that had grown frustrated with its inability to flow backward, to revisit the mountain peaks where it began, or to change the course it had carved through valleys. The river spent so much energy fighting its current, he continued, that it forgot the beauty of simply flowing. It was only when a leaf fell upon its surface, surrendering completely to the water's movement, that the river remembered that grace lies not in controlling the journey, but in embracing it fully. The story resonated through Nethera's understanding, like ripples through still water. She realized that her mastery over time had become a form of resistance to time itself. In learning to manipulate temporal flow, she had forgotten how to flow with it. But how does one who can change time learn to accept it? She asked her hands, never pausing in their weaving, despite her growing contemplation. Ethan smiled understanding in his expression. Perhaps by weaving something that celebrates time's natural rhythm, rather than altering it. What would a tapestry look like that honored the perfect pace of each moment? The suggestion sparked something in Nithera that had lain dormant for years. The pure desire to create beauty for its own sake. She found herself envisioning a piece that would capture the natural tempo of existence, the patient growth of crystals, the gentle cycles of seasons, the unhurried development of wisdom in aging hearts. Over the following days, as Ethan remained in the cave, sharing philosophical insights and simple presence, Nithera began a new project. Instead of threads spun from captured moments, she worked with fibers that represented time's natural flow, the steady strand of a turtle's measured movement, the rhythmic chord of tidal breathing, the gentle weave of seedlings reaching toward light. As she worked on this new tapestry, something remarkable happened. Her perception of time began to shift. Instead of experiencing each moment as a burden to be endured or a resource to be allocated, she found herself settling into the present with increasing comfort. The act of honoring time's natural pace through her art taught her to honor it in her own experience. The tapestry grew slowly, deliberately, without urgency or deadline. Its patterns emerged organically, reflecting the inherent wisdom in time's unforced progression. Where her previous works had been exercises in temporal manipulation, this piece became a meditation on temporal acceptance. Ethan observed her transformation with quiet satisfaction. You are learning that true mastery over time comes not from changing it, but from aligning with it so completely that the distinction between controller and controlled disappears. As the tapestry neared completion, Nithera realized that her relationship with her gift had fundamentally changed. She would continue to help others with their temporal needs, but now from a place of centered presence, rather than disconnected manipulation. Her craft would become a bridge between the urgency of human wanting and the patience of natural unfolding. When Ethan prepared to continue his wandering, he paused at the cave entrance, looking back at the timekeeper, who had learned to keep time with herself. Remember, he said, that the most powerful magic happens not when we impose our will upon the world, but when we discover our will is already in harmony with something larger than ourselves. After his departure, Nithera hung her new tapestry, where the morning light could illuminate its gentle patterns. Visitors continued to seek her services, but they found a different kind of assistance now. Instead of simply altering their temporal experience, she helped them understand their relationship with time itself, teaching them to find peace within whatever rhythm their lives required. The cave took on a different quality, becoming not just a workshop for temporal manipulation, but a sanctuary where people could learn to dance with time rather than fight against it. And in the phosphorescent glow of ancient crystals, Nithera wove both tapestries and moments with equal reverence, finally understanding that the greatest gift she could offer was not the power to change time, but the wisdom to embrace it. Story 5. Valendra and the Mirror of Forgotten Faces. In the borderlands, where twilight lingered longer than in ordinary places, there existed a sanctuary tended by a mirror keeper named Valendra, whose calling was both beautiful and melancholy. She was the guardian of the Mirror of Forgotten Faces, an ancient reflective surface that captured and preserved the images of all those who had been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten by the world. Valendra's sanctuary occupied a circular chamber carved from moonstone, its walls smooth as still water and luminous with inner light. The great mirror stood at the center, its surface rippling with the faces of countless souls who had passed through life without being truly seen. The servant, who cleaned grand halls while remaining invisible to their occupants, the elderly woman who sat alone in parks, watching children play the street musician, whose melodies provided soundtrack to hurried lives that never paused to acknowledge their creator. Her own reflection never appeared in the mirror, for Valendra had achieved that peculiar state of selflessness that comes from dedicating one's existence entirely to witnessing others. She moved through the sanctuary with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to see beauty in every human face, regardless of conventional standards or social recognition. Each day brought new faces to the mirror's surface, souls who had lived and died, feeling unseen, their stories untold, their contributions unacknowledged. Valendra's role was to witness each face fully, to speak their names when they appeared, and to ensure that someone somewhere recognized their existence with complete attention and compassion. The weight of this responsibility had gradually isolated her from the living world. She spent so much time honoring the forgotten that she had herself become forgotten, known only to the few seekers who found their way to her sanctuary, seeking understanding of invisibility and recognition. One evening, as autumn rain drummed against the sanctuary's crystal dome, a visitor arrived whose presence immediately drew Valendra's attention away from the mirror for the first time in decades. Korthak was a portrait painter whose skill was renowned throughout many kingdoms, yet he approached the sanctuary with the hesitant steps of someone who had lost faith in his ability to capture truth, keeper of the unseen. He said, his voice carrying the frustration of an artist who had achieved technical mastery but lost connection with his deeper purpose. I have come because my paintings, though praised for their beauty, feel hollow to me. I fear I am creating images that please the eye but fail to reveal the soul. Valendra turned from the mirror to study this painter, whose hands were stained with pigments but whose eyes seemed dimmed by doubt. She recognized in him the particular suffering of those who work in the realm of images, yet have lost sight of what images can reveal. You paint what people want to see, she observed gently, but perhaps you have forgotten how to see what needs to be painted. Korthak nodded, his shoulders sagging with the weight of unfulfilling success. My portraits hang in palaces and manor houses, capturing the likenesses of the wealthy and powerful. Yet I feel as though I am creating beautiful lies, images that show only surfaces while the deeper truth remains hidden. Valendra gestured toward the mirror, its surface currently showing the face of a woman who had spent her life caring for others' children, while her own dreams of motherhood went unfulfilled. Tell me what you see. Korthak approached the mirror and studied the reflected face. At first, he saw only the ordinary features of middle age, lines around the eyes, graying hair skin marked by years of modest living. But as he continued to look, guided by Valendra's patient presence, something shifted in his perception. I see grief, he said slowly, but also a kind of fierce love. This woman has known loss, but it has made her gentler, not bitter. There is strength in her face that has nothing to do with power and everything to do with endurance. Yes, Valendra said softly, and this is what your commissioned portraits miss. Not the absence of beauty, but the presence of a different kind of beauty, the kind that emerges from living fully, from facing life's challenges with courage and compassion. Over the following days, Korthak remained in the sanctuary, studying the faces that appeared in the mirror. Each one taught him something new about the art of truly seeing. He observed how dignity could shine through poverty, how wisdom could illuminate even the most ordinary features, how love could transform the most conventional face into something luminous. Valendra shared stories of the faces he studied. The baker, who rose before dawn for 40 years to provide fresh bread for his community. The teacher, who continued to believe in students. Everyone else had given up on the grandmother who kept family stories alive through generations of telling. These people were not forgotten because they lacked value, she explained as they watched a new face emerge in the mirror. A man who had spent his life repairing old books, preserving knowledge for future generations, while receiving little recognition for his careful work. They were forgotten because the world often fails to recognize value that cannot be measured in conventional terms. Korthak began to sketch the faces he saw, but his approach was different now. Instead of focusing on capturing physical likeness, he sought to reveal the inner light that Valendra helped him perceive. His drawings began to capture something ineffable, the essence of lives lived with quiet dignity and purpose. I understand now why you never appear in the mirror, he told Valendra one morning as she tended the sanctuary's simple garden. You have learned to see so clearly that you have become transparent to yourself, a perfect witness. Valendra paused in her watering, considering his words. Perhaps, she said thoughtfully, but I wonder sometimes if I have become so focused on seeing others that I have forgotten to let myself be seen. The observation sparked something in both of them. Korthak realized that his artistic gift was not meant to serve only those who could afford to commission portraits, but to reveal the inherent dignity in every face. And Valendra began to understand that her role as witness was incomplete without allowing herself to be witnessed in return. Together, they conceived of a new project. Korthak would create a series of paintings based on the faces in the mirror, but these would not be private artworks hidden in a sanctuary. They would be displayed in public spaces where people could encounter them daily, learning to see the beauty in faces they might otherwise overlook. As they worked together, something remarkable happened. The mirror began to reflect not only the forgotten faces, but also the faces of those who stopped to truly see the paintings. Viewers who were learning to look beyond surface appearances, to recognize the deeper beauty in every human countenance. We are creating a different kind of mirror, Valendra realized watching as people stood before Korthak's paintings with expressions of growing recognition and compassion. One that reflects not just what is, but what becomes possible when we truly see each other. Korthak smiled his hands once again, eager to create as he prepared another canvas. And I am learning that the greatest portraits are not those that capture how people look, but those that reveal how they deserve to be seen. When the project was complete, Valendra made a decision that surprised even herself. She began to venture out from the sanctuary, visiting the places where Korthak's paintings were displayed, observing how art could serve as a bridge between the seen and unseen worlds. The mirror of forgotten faces remained in her care, but it no longer held the weight of being the only place where the overlooked could be truly witnessed. Instead, it became the source of a spreading recognition, an understanding that every face carries stories worth seeing, every person possesses dignity worth acknowledging, and every life contains beauty that awaits only the right kind of attention to reveal itself. In the sanctuary, where twilight painted everything in shades of compassion, Valendra continued her work as keeper of forgotten faces, but now she knew that the ultimate purpose of remembering was not preservation, but transformation, helping the world learn to see with the same clarity she had cultivated in solitude. Story 6. Isadora and the Lighthouse of Lost Ships. On a windswept peninsula where the sea met sky, In an endless conversation of waves and clouds stood a lighthouse, tended by a keeper named Isadora, whose light guided, more than ships, through treacherous waters. Her beacon had the peculiar ability to call to vessels that were lost not in space, but in purpose. Ships whose crews had forgotten their destination, captains who had lost faith in their navigation, and sailors who no longer remembered why they had set sail. Isadora's lighthouse rose from black rocks, polished smooth by centuries of storms, its spiral staircase carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on the viewer's needs. The beacon at its crown burned not with ordinary flame, but with a light that drew its power from the collective hope of all who had ever yearned for safe harbor. For 30 years, Isadora had maintained her vigil, watching the horizon for ships that appeared as much in dreams as in waking sight. Her lighthouse called to phantom vessels, carrying crews of the spiritually adrift, those who had lost their way in life's vast ocean and found themselves sailing aimlessly through days that blended into meaningless succession. Each night, she climbed the winding stairs to tend the beacon, adjusting its focus based on intuition that had been honed by decades of service. Sometimes the light needed to shine broadly, offering general guidance to many lost souls. Other times, it required precise focus, sending a narrow beam to rescue a single traveler from the darkness of despair. The isolation of her calling had gradually transformed Isadora into something between human and elemental force. Her copper hair had been bleached white by salt spray, and sacred duty, her sea-green eyes had developed the ability to see through veils of illusion, and her hands had grown strong from hauling in the emotional anchors of those who had been lost at sea within themselves. One storm-torn evening, as rain lashed the lighthouse with the fury of unleashed grief, a ship materialized through the tempest, unlike any Isadora had guided before. The vessel seemed to be constructed from crystallized regret, its sails woven from sighs, its hull carved from petrified tears. At its helm stood a figure she recognized as Corvus, a navigator whose reputation for finding impossible passages had made him legendary among seafarers. Keeper of the beacon. Corvus called through the storm, his voice carrying across the water with supernatural clarity. I have been sailing for longer than I can remember, yet I can no longer recall what shore I seek. My compass spins without direction. My charts show only blank ocean, and my crew has grown silent with despair. Isadora had encountered many lost vessels, but never one whose pilot was himself a master navigator. She recognized in Corvus the particular tragedy of those whose expertise becomes their prison, those who know all the techniques of their craft, yet have lost touch with its deeper purpose. Drop anchor, she called back, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the howling wind. Let your ship rest while we discover together what has been forgotten. The crystalline vessel settled in the lighthouse's protected cove, and Corvus made his way up the winding path that led to Isadora's dwelling. He moved with the careful steps of someone who had walked many decks in rough weather, yet there was uncertainty in his bearing, as if he no longer trusted his own balance. In the lighthouse's lamp room, surrounded by the warm glow of the beacon, Corvus shared his story. He had begun his career with dreams of exploration and discovery, mapping unknown waters and finding safe passage for those who trusted his guidance. His skill had grown legendary, his services sought by merchants, adventurers, and refugees alike. But somewhere in the accumulation of successful voyages, he said, staring out at the storm that reflected the turbulence in his own spirit, I lost sight of why I originally felt called to the sea. Navigation became mere technique. Routes became routine. and the ocean that once filled me with wonder became simply a problem to be solved. Isadora nodded with deep understanding. She had seen this pattern in many of the lost souls her beacon attracted. The gradual transformation of calling into mere competence, the slow erosion of purpose, until only hollow skill remained. "When did you last feel joy in setting course for a new destination?" she asked, gently adjusting the beacon's focus to send comfort rather than mere guidance. Corvus considered the question for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting the internal search for a memory that seemed almost beyond recovery. "I cannot remember," he finally admitted. "Perhaps that is why my compass spins. It can find north, but I no longer know what lies north of where I truly wish to be." The lighthouse keeper moved to a cabinet filled with charts unlike any terrestrial maps. These were navigation aids she had created over decades of guiding the spiritually lost. Charts that showed not geographical features, but the topography of purpose, meaning, and authentic direction. "Tell me," she said, spreading one of these unusual maps across the lamp room's table, "what did the ocean represent to you when you first heard its call?" As Corvus studied the chart, which showed currents of inspiration and winds of possibility rather than physical features, something began to stir in his memory. He spoke haltingly at first, then, with growing clarity, of a young man who had stood on a harbor dock and seen in the endless horizon not just distant lands, but infinite potential for connection and discovery. "I wanted to bridge distances," he said, his voice gaining strength as the memory crystallized. "Not just physical distances, but the spaces between people, between cultures, between what is and what could be. The ocean was not an obstacle to overcome, but a medium for connection." Isadora smiled, recognizing the moment when a lost soul begins to relocate their true north. "And what bridges have you built in your years of navigation?" The question opened floodgates of recollection. Corvus remembered the refugee family he had guided to safety, watching parents weep with relief as their children stepped onto solid ground. He recalled the young scholars he had transported to distant libraries, their eyes bright with anticipation of knowledge to be discovered. He thought of the messages he had carried between separated lovers, the trade routes he had established that brought prosperity to remote communities, the rescue missions where his skill had meant the difference between life and death. "I had forgotten," he said quietly, "that every voyage was an act of connection. I became so focused on the technical aspects of navigation that I lost sight of the human purposes each journey served." As dawn approached and the storm began to subside, Isadora guided Corvus back to his ship, but the vessel had transformed during the night. The crystallized regret had dissolved into something translucent and beautiful. The sails of sighs had become canvas, filled with renewed purpose, and the hull of petrified tears had become strong wood, ready for noble voyages. "Your compass will work again," Isadora told him as he prepared to set sail, "because you remember now that true navigation is not about finding the fastest route, but about choosing destinations worthy of the journey." Corvus raised his hand in farewell, his crew visible once more, not the silent figures of despair they had been, but eager sailors ready to serve purposes larger than mere transit. "And what of you, keeper? You guide others to their destinations. But when did you last set sail yourself?" The question lingered in the salt air, long after his ship had disappeared beyond the horizon. Isadora realized that in dedicating herself entirely to guiding others, she had become as fixed in position as the lighthouse itself. Her purpose had become her prison, just as technical mastery had trapped Corvus. That evening, as she climbed the spiral stairs to tend the beacon, Isadora made a decision that would have seemed impossible the day before. She began training others in the art of lighthouse keeping, sharing the knowledge that had been hers alone for 3 decades. The beacon's light grew stronger as more keepers joined the vigil, each bringing their own gifts to the calling. And sometimes, when the conditions were right and the light was in capable hands, Isadora would step aboard the small boat she had never used and sail out into the waters she had watched for so long, discovering that the ocean held different lessons for those who experienced it directly rather than from a fixed position. The lighthouse continued its work of guiding lost vessels, but now it served also as a reminder that even those who dedicate their lives to helping others find direction must occasionally check their own compass, ensuring that service does not become stagnation, and that the very dedication that makes them valuable guides does not prevent them from continuing their own journey toward authentic purpose. Story 7. Eldanor and the Garden of Healing Stones. In valleys where morning mist carried the whispered prayers of ancient trees, there flourished a garden unlike any other, tended by a stone speaker named Eldanor, whose gift allowed him to hear the healing songs that minerals sang to wounded souls. His garden was arranged not in rows or patterns familiar to ordinary gardeners, but in spirals and circles that followed the natural harmonies of crystalline formation and geological wisdom. Eldanor moved through his domain with the patient reverence of someone who understood that stones measure time in epochs rather than seasons. His silver-threaded hair was always adorned with small crystals that chimed softly as he walked, creating music that helped attune his consciousness to the slower rhythms of mineral communication. His hands, weathered by decades of handling rough stones, had developed an extraordinary sensitivity that could detect the subtlest vibrations of healing energy. Each stone in the garden had been placed according to principles that transcended human understanding of horticulture. Amethyst clusters grew beside beds of medicinal herbs, their purple depths amplifying the plant's healing properties. Rose quartz formations surrounded areas where visitors came to mend broken hearts, their gentle pink emanations providing comfort that words could never offer. Obsidian monuments stood at the garden's edges, creating boundaries that absorbed negative energies and transformed them into neutral earth force. For 40 years, Eldanor had served as intermediary between the mineral kingdom and those seeking healing that conventional medicine could not provide. People arrived at his garden carrying ailments of body, mind, and spirit, drawn by stories of miraculous recoveries and unexplained peace found among his carefully arranged stones. His reputation attracted visitors from distant lands, warriors whose souls had been scarred by battles. They could not forget artists, blocked by creative despair, lovers separated by misunderstandings that seemed impossible to bridge. Each person who entered the garden was guided to specific stone formations that responded to their particular need, as if the minerals themselves possessed diagnostic wisdom beyond human comprehension. Yet despite his gift for facilitating healing in others, Eldanor carried within himself a wound that no stone had been able to touch. Years of absorbing others' pain, of serving as conduit between human suffering and mineral wisdom, had gradually isolated him from his own emotional landscape. He could sense the needs of every visitor, but had lost touch with his own heart's requirements. One autumn morning, when golden light transformed the garden into a cathedral of crystalline beauty, an unexpected visitor appeared at the entrance. Seraphine was a music healer whose reputation matched Eldanor's own. Yet she approached his sanctuary not as a colleague, but as someone in desperate need of the services she typically provided to others. "Stone speaker," she said, her voice carrying the trained resonance of someone who used sound as medicine, yet now it trembled with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I have come because the music that once flowed through me has fallen silent. I can still teach technique and theory, but the healing frequencies that made my work meaningful have abandoned me. Eldenor studied this healer whose crisis mirrored his own unacknowledged condition. He recognized in her the particular suffering of those whose gifts become burdens, whose service to others gradually erodes their connection to the source of their abilities. "Walk with me," he said, leading her along pathways bordered by stones that hummed with barely audible frequencies. "Tell me when your music became mere sound, when healing became simply methodology." As they moved through the garden, Seraphine shared her story. She had begun her career with an intuitive understanding of how specific tones could dissolve emotional blockages, how certain rhythms could realign disrupted energy patterns, how music could serve as bridge between the broken and the whole. My early sessions were like conversations between my voice and the client's need, she explained, as they paused beside a formation of singing crystals that responded to spoken word with harmonic resonance. I would listen with my entire being, then allow the appropriate sounds to emerge naturally. But as my reputation grew, I began to systematize the process, creating protocols and procedures that could be taught and repeated. Eldenor nodded with deep recognition. And in making your gift reliable, you made it routine. In ensuring consistent results, you lost connection with the spontaneous source that originally made your healing work possible. They continued walking, entering a section of the garden where meteorite fragments had been arranged around a natural spring. The space held an otherworldly quality, as if pieces of distant stars were sharing their cosmic perspective with the earthbound water. I have observed this pattern in many healers. Eldenor continued settling onto a bench carved from a single piece of jade. We become so focused on serving others that we forget to maintain our own connection to the mystery we channel. We transform from instruments of healing into mechanisms of technique. Seraphine sat beside him, her hands unconsciously moving in patterns that had once accompanied her therapeutic singing. But how does one recover what has been systematized away? How do we return to spontaneity when we have become experts in control? The question hung in the air between them, mixing with the subtle harmonics produced by the garden's mineral arrangements. Eldenor realized that in attempting to answer her inquiry, he was being asked to solve his own parallel dilemma. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the solution lies not in trying to recover what we have lost, but in allowing ourselves to become beginners again, to approach our gifts with the same wonder we once felt before we understood how they worked." As if in response to his words, the stones around them began to emit more pronounced harmonics, their frequencies weaving together in patterns neither healer had heard before. The sound was not musical in any conventional sense, yet it carried a quality that bypassed intellectual analysis and spoke directly to their deeper knowing. Seraphine found herself responding to the stone song with vocalizations she had not planned, wordless tones that seemed to emerge from some source deeper than conscious technique. Her voice intertwined with the mineral harmonics, creating a therapeutic frequency unlike anything in her previous repertoire. Eldenor listened with amazement as the stones in his garden responded to Seraphine's intuitive singing by producing complementary tones, creating a spontaneous symphony of healing that neither human skill nor mineral wisdom could have achieved independently. We have been trying to heal others, he realized, while forgetting that true healing happens in relationship, not just between healer and client, but between all the elements that contribute to wellness. I thought my gift was understanding stones, but perhaps it is actually facilitating connections between different forms of consciousness. Over the following days, Seraphine remained in the garden, and together they explored new approaches to their healing work. Instead of treating clients individually, according to established protocols, they began creating opportunities for spontaneous collaboration between human need, mineral wisdom, and sonic healing. Their sessions became improvisational performances where the stone's natural frequencies, Seraphine's intuitive vocalizations, and each client's unique requirements combined to produce therapeutic experiences that could never be repeated or systematized. "I understand now," Seraphine said, as she prepared to return to her own practice, her voice once again carrying the resonant quality that marked her as a true sound healer. We cannot heal others from a place of disconnection from our own source. The moment we stop being moved by the mystery we serve, we become obstacles to the very healing we wish to facilitate. Eldenor smiled, feeling his own connection to the stone's wisdom flowing more freely than it had in years. And perhaps that is why we were both called to this garden at the same time, not just to recover our individual gifts, but to remember that healing is always a collaborative art, requiring partnership between all the forces that serve wholeness. After Seraphine's departure, Eldenor restructured his garden's operations to reflect his renewed understanding. Instead of positioning himself as intermediary between stones and seekers, he became facilitator of three-way conversations that included his own authentic presence as essential element. The garden's healing capacity expanded exponentially as Eldenor learned to participate fully in the therapeutic process rather than simply administering it. Visitors found not only the mineral wisdom they sought, but also authentic human connection with someone who remained genuinely moved by the mystery he served. In the crystalline sanctuary, where stones sang healing songs to any who would listen, Eldenor continued his work as stone speaker, but now he understood that the most powerful healing happened when the healer allowed themselves to be healed alongside those they served, creating communities of mutual restoration rather than hierarchies of expert and patient. Story 8. Narration and the Sanctuary of Forgotten Songs. In mountains where eagles carried melodies on thermal currents and wind-carved symphonies from stone, there existed a sanctuary dedicated to preserving the songs that had been lost to the world. Its keeper, a melody guardian named Narration, possessed the rare ability to hear music that lingered in places long after its creators had fallen silent, and his calling was to gather these orphaned compositions before they faded completely from existence. Narayan's sanctuary occupied a series of natural caves that had been shaped by millennia of wind into acoustic chambers of perfect resonance. Each cavern held songs from different eras and cultures, lullabies that mothers had hummed to children who never lived to learn them work, songs that had died with the trades they once accompanied, ceremonial chants from rituals that time had forgotten. The melody guardian moved through his domain with the careful attention of someone who understood that music exists in the spaces between notes as much as in the sounds themselves. His long fingers, trained by decades of capturing ephemeral melodies, could pluck harmonic fragments from the air and weave them into coherent compositions that preserved not just the notes, but the emotions and intentions of their original creators. His collection had grown vast over the years. Cave walls lined with crystalline formations served as natural recording devices, each crystal attuned to specific frequencies and capable of holding musical memories for centuries. Visitors to the sanctuary often spoke of hearing faint melodies that seemed to emerge from the stones themselves, songs that evoked memories of places they had never been and times they had never lived. Yet despite being surrounded by countless musical treasures, Narration had gradually fallen into a peculiar form of deafness. He could detect and preserve the faintest traces of forgotten melodies, but he had lost the ability to hear music that was actually being created in the present moment. His gift had become so specialized that it excluded the very thing it was meant to celebrate: living, breathing, evolving musical expression. This limitation had isolated him from the contemporary world of music making. While bards and composers in distant cities were creating new songs that spoke to their time's joys and sorrows, Nerion remained in his mountain sanctuary, devoted entirely to music's past, unable to participate in its present development. One spring morning, when wildflowers painted the mountainsides in symphonies of color, an unusual visitor arrived at the sanctuary's entrance. Lyricin was a young composer whose reputation was growing rapidly in the valleys below. Yet she climbed the steep path to Nerion's caves, not as a successful artist, but as someone facing a creative crisis that threatened to silence her voice forever. Guardian of lost songs, she said, her voice carrying the trained projection of someone accustomed to filling concert halls, yet now subdued by uncertainty. I have come seeking understanding of why new melodies no longer come to me. My technique remains strong. My knowledge of theory is complete, yet the songs that once flowed through me like mountain streams have dried to barely a trickle. Nerion studied this young composer, whose predicament seemed to mirror his own in reverse. Where he could hear only music from the past, she seemed cut off from the source of future compositions. He recognized in her the particular frustration of creative artists whose gifts appear to have abandoned them without explanation. Walk with me through the caves, he offered, leading her into the sanctuary's acoustic chambers. Perhaps in hearing what has been lost, you will understand what you seek to find. As they moved through the crystalline caverns, Nerion activated various formations, allowing their stored melodies to fill the air with ghostly music from bygone ages. Lyrican listened with growing fascination to work songs from extinct crafts, dance melodies from vanished cultures, and prayer chants from spiritual traditions that existed now only in these preserved fragments. These songs are beautiful, she said, as they paused in a chamber dedicated to children's music from across the centuries, but they feel somehow incomplete, as if they are waiting for something. Nerion nodded thoughtfully. I have noticed this quality in many of the melodies I preserve. They seem to carry an expectation, as if they were created not as final statements, but as conversations waiting for responses. The observation sparked something in Lyricin's understanding. She began to hum softly, creating harmonic responses to the ancient melodies that filled the cave. Her voice wove between the crystallized songs, creating musical dialogues that bridged centuries of separation. As she sang, something remarkable occurred. The preserved melodies began to respond to her contemporary musical sensibilities, evolving and developing in ways their original creators might never have imagined. Ancient work songs gained new verses that spoke to modern labors. Old lullabies found fresh expressions of timeless parental love, and ceremonial chants discovered contemporary applications for age-old spiritual longings. I understand now why my own compositions have felt stagnant. Lyricin realized her voice gaining strength as the musical conversation continued. I was trying to create entirely new music, as if nothing had come before me. But creativity is not about generating something from nothing. It is about adding our voice to an ongoing conversation that stretches back through all of musical history. Nerion listened with amazement as his sanctuary filled with living music. For the first time in decades, the interaction between preserved melodies and contemporary creativity was creating something entirely new. Not just old songs revived or new compositions created, but a third possibility that honored both past and present while pointing toward future possibilities. And I see now why I lost the ability to hear current music, he said, his own voice joining the growing symphony. I became so focused on preserving the past that I forgot music's essential nature as a living, evolving art form. The songs I collected were never meant to be museum pieces. They were meant to continue growing through interaction with new voices. Over the following days, Lyrisin remained in the sanctuary, and together they developed a new approach to both preservation and creation. Instead of simply storing old melodies in crystalline isolation, they began creating what they called musical genealogies, compositions that showed how ancient songs could evolve through interaction with contemporary sensibilities. Their collaborative work revealed that creativity was not about individual inspiration, but about conscious participation in humanity's ongoing musical conversation. Each new composition was actually a response to countless musical ancestors, while each preserved melody gained renewed relevance through engagement with contemporary artistic vision. We were both suffering from the same misconception, Lyrisin observed as she prepared to return to the valleys, where her renewed creativity would find eager audiences. We thought of music as something that could be owned or controlled, rather than something that flows through us as part of a larger stream of human expression. Narration smiled, hearing in her words the harmony he had been seeking without knowing it. The most beautiful songs have always been those that acknowledge their connection to all the music that came before, while remaining fully present to their own moment of creation. After Lyricin's departure, Narration transformed his sanctuary from a museum of lost melodies into a workshop where past and present could meet in creative dialogue. Musicians from many traditions began making pilgrimages to the mountain caves, not just to hear preserved songs, but to discover how their own musical heritage could inform their contemporary creativity. The crystalline chambers that had once held static recordings of forgotten music became resonant spaces where ancient melodies could evolve through interaction with living voices. Each visit added new layers to the musical conversations, creating compositions that were simultaneously ancient and contemporary, individual and collective. Narayan's role evolved from guardian of musical artifacts to facilitator of musical continuity. He learned to hear the connections between past and present melodies, helping contemporary musicians understand their place in the great ongoing symphony of human creativity, while ensuring that ancient musical wisdom remained alive and relevant to new generations. In the mountain sanctuary, where wind and stone had learned to sing together, Narration continued his work with renewed purpose, understanding finally that the greatest service to music's past was to ensure its active participation in music's future, creating bridges between what had been and what was yet to become through the eternal present moment of creative expression. Story 9, Kaida and the Observatory of Invisible Stars. High above the clouds, where atmospheric thinness made the boundary between Earth and cosmos nearly imperceptible, there stood an observatory, unlike any built by conventional astronomers. Its keeper, a star reader named Kaida, possessed the extraordinary ability to perceive celestial bodies that existed beyond the spectrum of ordinary vision, stars that had collapsed into pure consciousness planets that existed only as potential, and galaxies that had transcended physical form while maintaining their gravitational influence on the visible universe. Kaida's observatory was constructed from materials that seemed to shift between solid and ethereal, depending on the viewer's state of awareness. The main telescope, carved from crystallized starlight collected over centuries, could focus not on distant objects, but on distant possibilities, showing glimpses of futures that depended on choices not yet made, pasts that existed in parallel dimensions, and presents that revealed themselves only to consciousness, prepared to perceive multiple layers of reality simultaneously. For 25 years, Kaida had spent her nights mapping constellations that existed in the spaces between ordinary stars, tracking the movements of invisible planets whose orbits influenced earthly affairs in ways that conventional astronomy could never measure. Her charts depicted Not the positions of physical objects, but the relationships between consciousness and cosmos, the subtle gravitational effects that thoughts and intentions exerted across vast distances. Her work attracted a unique clientele, mystics seeking to understand their place in the cosmic order, philosophers grappling with questions of existence and meaning, and occasionally individuals whose spiritual development had reached the point where they could sense the presence of realities beyond physical perception. Each visitor came seeking guidance, not about earthly matters, but about their relationship to the infinite. Yet despite her profound connection to cosmic consciousness, Kaida had gradually become disconnected from terrestrial life. Her constant focus on the vast and eternal had made her increasingly unable to perceive the beauty and significance of immediate finite experiences. She could track the movement of invisible galaxies, but had forgotten to notice the changing seasons in the valley below her observatory. This disconnection had begun to affect her cosmic observations as well. The invisible stars seemed to be growing dimmer, their messages less clear, as if her alienation from earthly existence was interfering with her ability to commune with celestial consciousness. One clear night, when the visible stars appeared with unusual brilliance, an unexpected visitor climbed the steep path to Kaida's observatory. Stellan was a young gardener whose humble profession belied an unusual sensitivity to natural rhythms and cosmic influences. He approached the observatory, not seeking cosmic revelation, but hoping to understand why his plants had begun responding to celestial cycles he could sense, but not see. "Reader of invisible stars," he said, his voice carrying the gentle directness of someone who worked daily with growing things. "I have come because my garden has begun to teach me about influences I cannot name. My vegetables ripen according to patterns that have nothing to do with visible moon phases. My flowers bloom in response to star movements I cannot track, and my soil seems to pulse with energies that follow cosmic rhythms beyond my understanding." Kaida studied this earthworker, whose concerns seemed almost trivially mundane compared to her cosmic investigations, yet something in his description resonated with anomalies she had noticed in her own observations. The invisible stars had indeed been following patterns that suggested connections to terrestrial consciousness she had not previously considered. "Show me your garden," she said, surprised by her own request. She had not descended from her observatory in months, having lost interest in earthly phenomena that seemed insignificant compared to cosmic mysteries. Stellan led her down the mountain path to a terraced garden that occupied a natural amphitheater carved into the hillside. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, Kaida could sense that this was no ordinary agricultural space. The plants were arranged, not in conventional rows, but in spirals and patterns that seemed to mirror celestial formations she had observed through her cosmic telescope. "I did not plan these arrangements consciously," Stellan explained, as they walked among beds where vegetables grew in geometric patterns that resembled star charts. "I simply planted according to what felt right, following intuitions about where each type of plant wanted to be positioned. Only later did I realize the patterns seemed to correspond to something astronomical." As dawn approached and the first light revealed the garden's full scope, Kaida experienced a revelation that reoriented her entire understanding of cosmic observation. The garden was indeed arranged according to celestial patterns, but not in imitation of the stars. Rather, it demonstrated how cosmic consciousness expressed itself through terrestrial manifestation. "Your plants are not responding to invisible stars," she told Stellan with growing excitement. "They are participating in the same consciousness that the invisible stars express. The cosmic patterns I observe through my telescope are not separate from earthly life. They are the underlying organizing principles that express themselves through all forms of conscious existence. Stellan nodded thoughtfully, his hands unconsciously moving to touch soil that seemed to pulse with gentle energy. I have sensed this connection, but I lacked the knowledge to understand what it meant. The garden seems to be teaching me that consciousness operates at every scale, from the cosmic to the microbial. Over the following days, as Kaida spent time in Stellan's garden while he visited her observatory, they began to understand how their different perspectives complemented each other. The cosmic patterns she observed through her telescope found their earthly expression in the natural arrangements his intuitive gardening had created. Working together, they developed a new approach to cosmic observation that integrated celestial and terrestrial awareness. Instead of viewing the invisible stars as distant objects to be studied, Kaida learned to perceive them as aspects of the same consciousness that expressed itself through garden soil growing plants and human intuition. I had been making the mistake of thinking that cosmic consciousness was separate from everyday awareness. She realized as she helped Stellan tend plants, whose growth patterns reflected the movements of invisible celestial bodies. But the stars I observe through my telescope are the same organizing intelligence that guides your hands in arranging this garden. Stellan smiled as earth-stained fingers, gentle on the leaves of plants, that seemed to grow more vibrant as their cosmic connections became conscious. And I was limiting myself by thinking that gardening was only about terrestrial matters, but every seed that sprouts is participating in the same creative force that births stars, and every harvest celebrates the same abundance that fills the cosmos with light. Their collaboration revealed that true cosmic awareness required integration of both celestial and terrestrial consciousness. The invisible stars became more visible to Kaida as she grounded her cosmic observations in earthly experience, while Stellan's gardening gained new dimension as he learned to consciously participate in the cosmic patterns his plants naturally followed. When Stellan returned permanently to his garden, Kaida found that her observatory had been transformed. The invisible stars now appeared with unprecedented clarity, their patterns revealing themselves as expressions of consciousness that operated equally through cosmic and terrestrial phenomena. She began welcoming visitors who sought to understand not just cosmic mysteries, but the integration of celestial awareness with earthly responsibility. Her star charts expanded to include agricultural cycles, seasonal celebrations, and the rhythms of daily life, showing how cosmic consciousness expressed itself through the most ordinary experiences. The greatest cosmic revelation, she would tell those who climbed to her observatory, seeking celestial wisdom, is the recognition that we do not need to transcend earthly existence to commune with infinite consciousness. We need only to perceive how infinite consciousness expresses itself through the immediate reality of our daily lives. In the observatory, where invisible stars sang to those prepared to hear their silent songs, Kaida continued her cosmic observations with renewed purpose, understanding, finally, that the universe revealed its deepest secrets, not to those who sought to escape terrestrial existence, but to those who learned to recognize celestial consciousness operating through earthly experience. Her telescope now focused equally on distant galaxies and nearby gardens, tracking the movements of invisible stars, while celebrating their visible expressions in flowering plants, ripening fruit, and the hands of gardeners who worked in conscious partnership with cosmic intelligence. Story 10. Arian and the Circle of Returning. At the confluence of 9 rivers, where waters from distant mountains finally merged into a single flowing stream, there lived a guide named Arian, whose unique calling was to help lost souls find their way back to themselves. His dwelling was built on an island that existed at the exact center of the convergence, surrounded by waters that carried the stories and songs of all the lands they had traveled through. Arian possessed the rare gift of recognizing the original essence that lived within each person, no matter how deeply it had become buried under layers of compromise, disappointment, or forgotten dreams. His eyes held the clarity of spring water, reflecting back to visitors not who they had become, but who they had always been, beneath the accumulated sediment of life's circumstances. The island sanctuary was designed as a perfect circle with pathways that spiraled inward toward a central garden, where 9 ancient trees grew in harmony, their roots intertwined beneath the earth, while their branches reached toward different quarters of the sky. Each tree represented one of the archetypal journeys that humans undertook in their quest for wholeness: the path of the healer, the seeker, the creator, the protector, the wisdom keeper, the bridge builder, the dream tender, the light bearer, and the returner. For decades, Arian had served as final guide for those who had wandered far from their authentic selves and were ready to undertake the journey home. His visitors were often individuals who had achieved external success but felt internally hollow, or those who had tried many spiritual practices without finding lasting peace, or simply souls who sensed they had lost connection with something essential but could not name what was missing. The process of return was different for each person, but it always began the same way, with Arian inviting them to sit beneath whichever of the 9 trees called to them most strongly. The trees served as mirrors, reflecting back the archetypal energy that formed the core of each visitor's authentic nature, helping them remember the fundamental pattern around which their truest self was organized. Yet despite his gift for helping others reconnect with their essential nature, Arian himself had begun to feel increasingly displaced. Years of serving as guide for returning souls had gradually separated him from his own journey, until he felt more like a guardian of pathways than a traveler upon them. One evening, as sunset painted the converging rivers in shades of copper and gold, a figure approached the island who was unlike any visitor Arian had guided before. Meridian was a fellow guide whose reputation for wisdom equaled Arian's own, yet she arrived not seeking direction, but offering companionship to someone she recognized as a kindred spirit, caught in the paradox of their calling. Guide of the returning, she said, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone who had learned to navigate the spaces between helping and healing. I have come because I sense in you the same displacement that once troubled my own path. You have become so skilled at helping others find home that you have forgotten where your own home lies. Arian studied this unexpected companion, whose presence immediately brought relief from the isolation he had not consciously acknowledged. You speak truly, he admitted, gesturing toward the 9 trees that had become so familiar they had lost their power to surprise or inspire him. I know these pathways so well that I no longer see them as destinations, but only as routes to guide others. I have become a map rather than a traveler. Meridian smiled, with deep understanding, settling onto the grass beneath the tree that represented the path of the bridge builder. Perhaps that is why I was called here, to remind you that even guides must occasionally become pilgrims, and that the deepest service sometimes requires us to step away from serving in order to remember what we truly have to offer. Over the following days, Meridian invited Arian to experience his own island sanctuary, as if encountering it for the first time. She guided him through exercises that helped him perceive familiar pathways with fresh awareness, encouraging him to approach each of the 9 trees, not as a guide, explaining their significance to others, but as a seeker, discovering their personal relevance to his own journey. Tell me, she asked as they sat beneath the tree of the returner, when did you last allow yourself to be surprised by wisdom, rather than simply dispensing it? The question pierced through years of accumulated expertise to touch something in Arian that had been dormant but not dead. He realized that in mastering the art of guidance, he had unconsciously closed himself off from the very experiences of discovery and transformation that made guidance meaningful. I had forgotten, he said slowly, that the most powerful guides are not those who have completed their journeys, but those who remain genuinely engaged in the ongoing process of becoming. I stopped being curious about my own development because I thought mastery meant having arrived rather than continuing to travel. Meridian nodded her eyes, reflecting the understanding that comes from having wrestled with similar paradoxes. The great secret of authentic guidance is that it emerges not from knowledge, but from presence, not from having found all the answers, but from remaining vitally connected to the questions that matter most. As they explored this insight together, Arian began to notice how his relationship to the island sanctuary shifted. Instead of seeing it as a static environment for helping others, he started experiencing it as a living mandala that continued to evolve and reveal new layers of meaning even to its guardian. Each of the 9 trees began speaking to him again, not as familiar fixtures in his guiding practice, but as active teachers offering lessons he was ready to receive. The path of the healer taught him about maintaining his own wholeness while serving others' healing. The way of the creator reminded him that guidance itself was a creative art that required fresh inspiration. The journey of the returner showed him that coming home was not a destination, but a continuous process of aligning with authentic nature. I understand now, Arian told Meridian, as they prepared to part ways, that I was trying to help others return to themselves from a position outside the journey, rather than recognizing that we are all always in the process of returning, and that authentic guidance emerges from shared engagement in that eternal homecoming. Meridian smiled her own journey, calling her toward distant horizons, where other guides might need the companionship she had provided. And perhaps that is the deepest teaching your island offers, that home is not a place we reach, but a quality of presence we cultivate, and that the most profound return is the recognition that we never actually left, only forgot how to see where we have always been. After Meridian's departure, Arian transformed his approach to guidance, but the change was subtle rather than dramatic. Instead of positioning himself as someone who helped others find their way, he became someone who traveled alongside seekers, sharing the journey of return, while continuing his own process of discovering home within himself. The island sanctuary remained a place of profound healing and return, but now it served also as a reminder that the deepest guidance comes not from those who have transcended the need for guidance, but from those who remain humbly engaged in their own ongoing process of becoming authentic. Visitors found in Arian not just a skilled guide, but a fellow traveler who understood that the journey home is never completed, but continuously deepened, and that the greatest gift we can offer others is not our expertise, but our willingness to remain genuinely present to the mystery of existence as it unfolds through each moment of conscious participation in life's eternal return to itself. In the sanctuary, where 9 rivers converged and 9 paths of return intersected, Arian continued his work with renewed understanding, knowing finally that the most profound service emerges when we stop trying to help others reach destinations we think we have attained, and instead offer our authentic presence to the shared journey of coming home, to who we have always been, beneath all our wandering.